So what I wanted to do today is go over first a preferred anti-Semitism typology. One of the most common things that people ask me, first and foremost, is how to define anti-Semitism. Louder? Oh my goodness. All right, this is me at full capacity, everyone. How about now? Okay, amazing. So one of the first things people ask me about anti-Semitism is how to define it, right? For a variety of reasons, I think that that's not where we should be starting when talking about anti-Semitism. Instead, I think we need to be thinking about how we measure anti-Semitism, and then these shared motivations that underlie anti-Semitism. And so what I want to do instead of starting off with a definition is to talk about the ways anti-Semitism manifests over time and build a typology. Next thing I want to do is give you an overview about changing anti-Semitism in America, arriving at where we are today. So to give you some of the factors that help to explain why we are where we are at this moment, because I think many people are not familiar with the history. And certainly, although I'm not a historian, I think a lot about the structural factors that help to explain why we're here today, dealing with the anti-Semitism that we are right now. I think many people are not familiar with what Jewish organizations are doing to combat anti-Semitism. They know small elements of what they're doing, but not all. And so I want to share my experience, especially working with Jewish organizations in this area, so you are familiar with what they are doing in the past and what they're doing right now to try to improve conditions for the Jewish community. And then we can talk a little bit about what the future might look like for American Jewry. I know in this moment, many people are deeply concerned about what comes next. And I'm going to give you an honest assessment on what I think that is. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. How does that sound? Wonderful. So when we talk about anti-Semitism, I think we often don't realize all the different ways empirical social scientists like myself aim to measure it. And when we think about measurement, all of a sudden, anti-Semitism takes on a new meaning. So you might have seen that the ADL just released its new audit, right? Showed an enormous increase in reported anti-Semitic incidents and hate crimes. One of the ways we measure anti-Semitism, that we try to assess levels of anti-Semitism, is by reported incidents, right? Events, hate crimes, in some cases, acts of terror. Another way we have been measuring anti-Semitism is through social media, right? We've heard a lot about TikTok, the role of Twitter, now X, in platforming anti-Semites and anti-Semitic messaging, right? We can count that. Actually, one of the ways we measure anti-Semitism is the responsiveness of these platforms to reported anti-Semitism. How quickly do they take it down? How frequently do they take it down? Do they take it down at all? We can also measure this in policy. Unfortunately, around the world, there is still governmental discrimination targeting Jews. There's societal discrimination, of course. And as we've seen with a lot of the congressional testimony as of recent, this is something that has infected our institutions, and specifically our institutions of higher education. And so we can measure discrimination institutionally as well. We also do really cool things now with our growing technology with network analysis, understanding what message is connected to what actors, how these messages are being developed, how they evolve over time, what messages are successful, and how are they being delivered. And most importantly, I think that the area of anti-Semitism we're most familiar with is that of anti-Semitic attitudes, beliefs, or survey measures, right? Our individual response measures that try to attempt to capture whether a group, whether an individual, whether society as a whole is engaging in specific levels of anti-Semitism. All of this makes sense so far? Great. So I want to give you guys a typology. I believe that this typology covers 99% of all anti-Semitism that manifests. Traditional anti-Semitism, secondary anti-Semitism, conspiratorial anti-Semitism, what I call universalist anti-Semitism, and lastly, anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, or what some have coined new anti-Semitism, which in my view is not particularly new, but we will talk about that too. So let me get into it. So what is traditional anti-Semitism? Right, really orienting in Christian supersessionism, this notion of deicide, usury and profiteering, ritual murder and blood libel, this notion of Jewish demonization, metaphysical components that we associate with Jews, well poisoning, host desecration, and yes, even male menstruation. We can talk more about that if you want, but I can't tell you too much about it. Secondary anti-Semitism, this notion that Jews invented the Holocaust, right? Holocaust denial in its most traditional form. The Jews exaggerate the Holocaust. Holocaust trivialization, Holocaust inversion, which we're seeing a lot of today. Holocaust instrumentalization, this notion that Jews are utilizing the Holocaust for their own gain. And collective victimhood and competing victimhood. We'll talk more about that later. What many people argue is the most important form of anti-Semitism today is conspiratorial anti-Semitism, in part because it's most closely connected to violent acts. Very hard to find a violent act of anti-Semitism that wasn't at least partially motivated by Jewish conspiracy. What has that looked like? Well, unfortunately, right, it's illogical. Jews are propagating capitalism and also communism, homosexuality, atheism, Satanism. We control the weather. Having been to Philadelphia twice in the last month, I definitely do not control the weather. Um, Controlling the media in Hollywood, controlling the Atlantic slave trade, controlling international finance, that we are the primary force behind global wars. This is one that's becoming more frequent. 9/11 conspiracies, COVID conspiracies, controls of global institutions. This is not even the tip of the iceberg, unfortunately, of all anti-Semitic conspiracies, but this gives you a good example of what this is. And let me also say, I didn't give anybody a what we call trigger warning. Um, I'm not a big fan of using that term for a whole variety of reasons, but I will tell you some of the images that you will see are not particularly savory. Um, I apologize. Please feel free to leave if you need to, but I think it's really important to provide primary source material. So a lot of the images that I've provided today come directly from hate organizations that I've mined. So um, that is what you're seeing here, right? This is an example on the right of a poster that's printed out and then often shared, in some cases at academic institutions, plastered. Um, they do what they call print bombing. And so they will hack into an institution's printer network and print out thousands of these copies. Sure. It says every single aspect of the COVID agenda is Jewish. The CDC director, Jewish. The CDC deputy director, Jewish. The CDC chief of staff, Jewish. The CDC chief medical officer, Jewish. The CDC director of the Washington office, Jewish. I can go on and on and on, right? And it gets into the head of Pfizer, Jewish. Moderna chief scientist, Jewish. Vanguard CEO, BlackRock president, Jewish. Jewish. Is that okay? Should I read more? At the very bottom, remember those who argued that if you are against lockdowns, you're against state power, were literally Shabbos goys carrying out the will of the Jews, wittingly or unwittingly. All right, let's transition into universalist anti-Semitism. This notion often comes with a real or faux human rights orientation. Um, it's this notion of Jewish obsession with wealth, with power, with status, um, this in-group prioritization that can come off as racist or supremacist. So we've all heard about Jewish supremacism, right? This is this universalist orientation. It frames Jewish traditions as archaic, specifically male circumcision and kosher slaughtering laws, and also talks about traditional religious practices being antithetical to human rights. And then the not so new anti-Semitism, or what we call anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, which at its core is the denial of Jewish self-determination, but it can also manifest as denial of Jewish connection, historical and religious, to the state of Israel, comparing Jewish treatment of Palestinians to Nazi treatment of Jews, which we're seeing done very, very frequently today, even in mainstream outlets. The blaming of Jews for the actions, real, exaggerated, or fictitious, of the state of Israel, right? Blaming the people in this room, blaming us as individuals. Concerns related to Israel and Jewish lobby control and manipulation of the American government. This is also manifested even in claims of Mossad blackmail, right? 10/7 denialism, this notion that Israel was actually the actor responsible for 10/7, also 9/11, and even organ harvesting, right? That one of the reasons why we engaged in 10/7, right, was so that Israel could harvest the organs of Palestinians. And what we can see in this wonderful image is a combination of many of these different forms of anti-Semitism. Anybody see something that strikes them specifically? Finger on the scale, I heard. Yes. Does anybody know what that scale represents? Justice. Justice. The Jew holding his finger on the scale of justice, making sure that the weight of the Holocaust is heavier than that of all other forms of genocide and human tragedy. Anybody else see something interesting? American flag and Israeli flag on a Tzahal IDF uniform covered in blood, right? Lots of different elements of anti-Semitic typology manifesting there. Anybody else? The teeth, the animal teeth, the eyes as well, even the pink skin, right? Um, Also the ears. The depths of the internet. Um, I I can answer that question. I'll have to look because I keep all these things on files. But this is a really well-known image. It's been utilized a lot, unfortunately. Yeah, it's pre-10/7. This is not a new image at all. I've been using this image during talks for, goodness, I want to say maybe 8 years now. And this particularly unsavory collection of images, I think, is important to share. Um, it's this notion that we also have white nationalist, neo-Nazi anti-Semitism that, and why this is so important is that this is often one of the key motivators of anti-Semitic violence because it suggests that Jews are orchestrating a genocide against white Europeans, both here in the United States as well as in Europe. How are they doing that, right? This is this interesting connection between Jews and anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, right? If you believe inherently, as many white nationalists do, that Black Americans, that Hispanic Americans, that non-Europeans are lesser than human, right? Then how can they pose a threat? So they need a Jewish metaphysical component, right, that's at the core of their motivation, their structure. And what that says, and Eric Ward, if you haven't read anything from Eric Ward, he wrote the essay Skin in the Game, talks about this very, very well, that really it's Jews that are promoting this cultural decay, that are behind the genocide, the slow genocide of whites. This was what motivated the attack at Tree of Life, and a whole series of other acts of anti-Semitic violence. We're only on part two. Oh my goodness. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. When we talk about anti-Semitism in different stages, right? I could give an entire course on this in terms of American history. So I'm going to break it out into different stages. Let me talk about pre-World War II anti-Semitism, right? This was something that occurred in the United States. It was blatant, it was often explicit, it was public. This was occurring from American celebrities, Henry Ford, Charles Coughlin, Feinberg. We can go on and on and on. And what my colleague, my amazing colleague from Columbia, Britt Tevis, what she argues is that this was structural, right? We often think of anti-Semitism as a social phenomena, but pre-World War II, anti-Semitism was structural. What did that look like? Instances of explicit discrimination, like if you were Jewish, you could not hold office, right? That law wasn't rescinded until, I believe, 1877 in New Hampshire. Um, Seemingly neutral legislation, like blue laws, put Jews at a disadvantage. Failure to pass protective laws to counter anti-Semitism, so think about the quota system at universities. Circumstances, right, in which individuals knowingly knew that the judiciary would not ever side in the favor of Jewish victims of discrimination. And then we saw this explicitly, right, with Plessy versus Ferguson, which permitted white business owners to exclude minorities, and that often included Jews. My mother has, I wouldn't call them fond memories, but vivid memories of exactly this happening to her in Raleigh, North Carolina. Absolutely. Redlining, we could go on and on and on. I don't claim that these slides and bullets that I'm sharing with you are exhaustive. But absolutely, redlining was one really important way in which Jews were discriminated against. Um, and I'm happy to share some resources on that as well if you're interested in learning more. So, where do we transition from a more traditional structural form of prejudice to a social one? Right? Anti-Semitism is commonly seen, certainly in the Jewish studies world, as a social phenomena. We really see this post-war. There was this strong desire in many American urban enclaves to really wipe out racism post-World War II. This is also the period that historians, Jewish and otherwise, suggest that the communities of Jews, Catholics specifically, Italians, Irish, etc., right, transition into America's, quote, white privilege class, end quote, that they made that transition at this time. What we see, though, is that there's still significant anti-Semitism that's ongoing, but it's polite. It's social exclusion. It's not being invited or allowed in specific areas, but we're not going to say it outright the way we did pre-war. I'm going to go quickly into the apex of American Jewry. Everybody remember how wonderful the 1990s were? Right? The height of American Jewish experience. Seinfeld. It was cool to be Jewish. Briefly, for a moment. We saw this mainstreaming of Jewish identity. People were converting into the religion. Um, People really romanticized this period. Let me tell you from an empirical standpoint, there was still a tremendous amount of anti-Semitic hate crimes that were targeting Jews during this period. This is when we see the ushering in, this beginning of this transition of the Nazification of hate groups, right? The rise of right-wing militia groups that often adopted this. We can think, of course, of the Oklahoma City bombing and others. So we romanticize this time, and I think for good reason, but it was not without very serious levels of anti-Semitism. And when did we really start falling off the cliff? I would argue it began with 9/11. What my colleague Amy Ellman would say actually is the largest anti-Semitic attack ever targeting American Jews. I'm not sure I agree with that assessment, but I think it's one that's important to share. So what happens with 9/11? We see that the neoconservative movement, which had many important Jewish leaders, is largely blamed for American adventurism in the Middle East. Um, we see that this results in anti-Israel backlash, and this occurs both in the mainstream and within the academic community. We see at the same time the collapse of Oslo, the Second Intifada, Southern Lebanon, the Gaza-Hamas conflicts, right? All of a sudden, this prospect of peace in the Middle East has really soured. And then we see Islamist and jihadist motivated attacks both here in the United States, thinking of the LAX attack, Seattle, but also across Europe. We also then have the Great Recession and this return of the economic anti-Semitism that was so prevalent in the United States during the Depression era. There's this Jewish association with Wall Street, and that leads to significantly higher levels of anti-Semitic attitudes and beliefs, targeting Jews, especially amongst those that are underemployed or unemployed. These statistics remain true today. And one of the things that I'll share that very few people know, because they're not looking at the data the way I'm able to, is that the generational cohort that has the highest levels of anti-Semitism is not Gen Z. It's millennials. It's millennials that lived through 9/11, that lived through this great economic recession, that still feel like they're underemployed, that are being the most heavily affected by the economy. This is a really important factor in why we're here today. Of course, we see the surge of white nationalist anti-Semitism, right? These hate groups really pulling from the populism and that backlash to Obama's election. Of course, everybody recalls this image, and I think it's very, very important to bring up Charlottesville because for many in the Jewish community, this was the first time they understood that there were actors seeking to violently harm them. Jews will not replace us. The Jewish community had not heard that phrase before. I also think it's really important to talk about racial discord and this notion of Jews being whitened. Actually, what we've identified through a series of survey experiments, I'm happy to show you, is that there is a whitening effect to being Jewish, right? So if I say I'm Jewish, individuals are going to assume that I'm white, regardless of what other characteristics that I have. We see, and I was actually just at a conference with Ilana Kaufman, who heads the Jews of Color Initiative, and she was recounting the story of how we got to this moment, from Ferguson to Palestine, occupation is a crime. Has anybody seen images like this? This connection between the plight of Black Americans and Palestinians. From Ferguson to Palestine was simply listed on the bottom of one tweet from an unknown person. This ushered in such a huge reaction from the Jewish community of St. Louis that the individuals, the bad actors, realized that this was great messaging, right? There's a real question in the eyes of Ilana Kaufman about whether or not we would see this connection today if it wasn't for the reaction to this tweet. But we also see Ilhan Omar, this conspiratorial anti-Semitism, Jews control the world, the development of what we should call the squad's anti-Israelism. And then, unfortunately, we see a series of high-profile violence and also anti-Semitic celebrity incidents associated with Black perpetrators, right? We had one here with Deshaun Jackson. And finally, 10/7. What I call the Nazification of Israel. Prior to 10/7, to accuse Israelis of being Nazis or to compare Israel to the Third Reich wasn't palatable in the mainstream. That has changed. What does this mean? What are the consequences? Well, it means the death of the two-state solution. It means the death of any hope that there can be any sort of reasonable approach to ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because just like we would think of the Nazis in World War II, would it have been palatable to negotiate with the Nazis? So if Israel is the new Nazis, it's not palatable to engage with them as a reasonable entity. and therefore the only solution among those that believe that Israel is no different than the Nazis is to destroy it. It has to be destroyed. That would be the arc of justice. What does this mean? It means the legitimization of violence targeting Israelis because it's legitimate to target Nazis. And it also means, unfortunately, the normalization of harassment and even violence targeting the Jewish diaspora, of which 4/5 will tell you that Israel is a really important element of their identity. They are Zionists. Globalize the Intifada. You've heard that ushered, right? That's what this is. So, anti-Semitism today, how did we get here? Conspiratorial anti-Semitism associated with Jews in foreign policy, conspiratorial anti-Semitism associated with Jews in the economy, conspiratorial anti-Semitism associated with white nationalism, conspiratorial anti-Semitism associated with white non-racial violence, all leading to, with 10/7, the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism associated with Israel and Zionism. Okay, so what are we doing about it? So the primary goal of Jewish legacy organizations, the ones we're all familiar with, ADL, AJC, right, has been to collect and report anti-Semitism data. Why? Not just to fundraise, right, but also to inform policy and lobbying efforts, right? That's at the core of what they're trying to do, secure the Jewish community. How do you do that? You need empirical evidence in order for those claims to be effective. The secondary goal has been to keep anti-Semitism, Holocaust education, and pro-Israel policy as a bipartisan issue. Unfortunately, post 10/7, that is changing on all fronts. An additional secondary goal of Jewish legacy organizations is to advise corporate and institutional partners on the best way to navigate anti-Semitism or policies promoting anti-Semitism. But we've seen this a lot, and a lot of criticism ushered in targeting the ADL regarding their roller coaster relationship with Elon Musk. A tertiary goal of Jewish legacy organizations has been to maintain alliances with other racial and ethno-religious partner groups, other marginalized groups, right? Jewish organizations have always had very close ties with other civil rights organizations. That is changing. An additional tertiary goal of Jewish legacy organizations has been to educate Jewish communities and beyond about anti-Semitism. So what have we been doing post 10/7? So working actively to reduce social media anti-Semitism, particularly on TikTok, particularly on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. What I'd say is this is often why relationships with these corporate actors seem so discombobulated, because there are varying efforts and varying beliefs about needing to be close to specific actors in these corporations and to name and shame them, right? And so oftentimes it seems like organizations are talking out of both sides of their mouth, but there usually is a strategy behind it. We are developing messaging and counter messaging. What does that look like? We've done a series of survey experiments aiming to understand the effectiveness of framing Zionism in certain ways. What if we mention the insecurity of Jews when we talk about Zionism? What if we mention the religious and historical connections to Israel when we talk about Zionism? What if we mention double standards when we talk about Zionism? What effect does that messaging have on people's favorability towards Israel? We are collaborating to provide legal services to victims of anti-Semitism. We've seen a lot of this as it relates to Title VI investigations occurring at institutions of higher education. And we're elevating Jewish narratives on the mainstream media, trying to amplify the concerns regarding anti-Semitism today. Nearing the end, and why we're all here, the future of American Jewry. I'm really, really lucky. I think I have the best job in the world, in part because I get to speak to all of you and learn from all of you and hear about what you're experiencing. What I'm hearing, especially post 10/7, is I'm hurting, I'm worried, I'm alone, and that one really hurts me. I'm scared, and unfortunately, I've been hearing from several, I wish I were not Jewish. The image on the left is, or on my right, that's right, who said that? Cooper Union, right? The library in Cooper Union where Jewish students had to be ushered out and were locked in because they were being harassed from a 10/7 protest. So what is the pessimistic view? It's pretty bad. Social anti-Semitism is once again transitioning into structural and legal anti-Semitism. We're going backwards. It's being defended by institutions. Institutions are not taking accountability, right? This is the first step into institutionalizing anti-Semitism. We see the mainstreaming of anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Zionist preferences, particularly among elements of the Democratic Party, and this is likely to destroy the bipartisan support Israel has enjoyed for many decades. Our current measures of anti-Semitism, I can't make this point strong enough, are off the charts. They're unthinkable. We've never seen anything like this before. We're talking, in some cases, 50-fold increases. So there's no history for us to look back to and say this is what we employed at this moment and this is what was successful and what isn't, because this moment is truly different. And of course, the saddest consequence of all, in my view, is that in this pessimistic view, many will choose to discard their Jewish identity and the Jewish identity of their children. We've seen this time and time and again throughout history, right? Why put your children through this? I've mentioned this before. I've named my daughter Galia, and there's not a day that goes by where I don't think about what the consequences of that might be for her. I did not think about that pre-10/7. Okay, the optimistic view. Try to end on a high note, they said. Okay, I'm going to put a smile on my face. Existing empirical research, and I can't believe I'm the academic that's citing himself right now. This is such a faux pas. Um, Suggests that this moment of heightened anti-Semitism will pass, right? I've done lots of large and quantitative analyses examining hate crime variation in the United States from 2001 to today. And what we find is that when Israel's engaged in military operations, we do see this heightened anti-Semitism. When those operations cease, it takes only about a week or two before levels of anti-Semitism to return to normal. 10/7 will serve as a rallying cry to unite our resources. We've seen this with a lot of the Jewish organizations I've had the privilege of working with, right? If we think about funding in this moment, times are pretty good. Now the question is, what do we do with that funding? And then 10/8, Jews, right? Bret Stephens had, at least initially, a very optimistic view about Jews post 10/7, that this is going to harden our Jewish identity. It's going to increase our commitment to Zionism. And I can tell you anecdotally, I have seen that too. And then, of course, we have the creation of the first graduate program of anti-Semitism studies in the United States. So clearly, we're taking this very seriously here at Gratz.